before we begin, you'll see I've put 4 topics up here on the board. We've got women in Victorian society, Ireland's cultural rebirth, warfare in the machine age, and immigrant literature. So what I would like you to do now is take a sheet of paper, write your student ID number, but not your name, right? Just your ID number at the top of the paper, and rank these topics in order of preference, right? From most interesting to least interesting to you.
I'm sorry, but can you have a pencil off of our...
Pardon?
A pencil or a pen?
Yeah, there's a pencil up here. Hold on a second. There you go.
Thank you.
And then when you're done, just go ahead and pass it up. Everybody done? All right, so go ahead and pass them on. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is take your preferences and, based on what you've given me, assign you a topic for your paired presentation in the second half of the semester, right? So you're going to be working with a partner to put together a 15-minute, at least 15-minute presentation on your assigned topic. Now, we are going to socially distance this as much as possible, right? I don't want you actually meeting physically with the partner. Try to conduct as much of your business as possible virtually. And when you are up in front of the classroom together, try to maintain your 6 feet distance as well. But I should have assignments back for you on this Thursday. Anybody who isn't here today, well, just gets randomly assigned to something. But I do also want to note that if your presentation partner is unresponsive or is not pulling their weight, right, don't worry about being a narc, right? Just let me know. so that I can intervene, right? Because you shouldn't have to do all the work by yourself if you are, like, that's the point of working with a partner, right? Is that it's not supposed to all be on you. And if it is all on you, that's not fair. So let me know if your presentation partner is unresponsive. Things may also shake out over the next few days, as midterm grades come out and whatnot, that, a couple of people who haven't been attending might end up withdrawing. So we might have 1 or 2 groups of 3 instead of pairs, right? Does anybody have any questions about this? None? Okay, so remember for next time, right, we're going to be reading Dickens' A Christmas Carol, which is going to be a literary expression of a lot of the issues we're going to be talking about today. And remember that paper 1 is due at midnight on Friday, right? And then that is the last thing that is going to count towards your midterm grade. Not everybody has taken the midterm exam yet, so we won't talk about that until everybody has completed it. I have to give a makeup exam to 1 or 2 people. But once that's done, then we'll discuss that as well. Okay, so let's then talk about industrialism. So first off, do you guys have any questions or comments about what you were asked to read for today?
Everything I understood till I think it was the last story. I was confused on what he was talking about.
Okay, which one is that? What are we looking at here?
What page is it again?
Well, we're looking at stuff that goes from page 633 out to page 651. Was it the thing about the match girls that was confusing to you?
I think so. Yeah, towards the. Yeah, I think it was the match workers.
Yeah.
Was that or?
Okay, and yeah, a lot of these, like, what we're looking at here is a mix of fiction and nonfiction, right? And the fictional works that we're looking at, the excerpts from the novels by Charles Kingsley and Charles Dickens, right? They're just short excerpts that describe physical places that have been affected by industrialism, right? So the big key takeaway from all of these is about how the Industrial Revolution affected everyday life for ordinary people in Britain, right? Now, as with any sort of major change in the way a society lives, right? The Industrial Revolution has upsides and downsides, right? There are pros and there are cons. So first, let's talk briefly about what made it possible in the first place. Now, primitive steam engines have been in existence since the ancient world, right? The Greeks were able to build them. But in the late 18th century, a Scottish engineer by the name of James Watt invents an improved version that is more efficient and more powerful than previous steam engines, right? So it's the first steam engine that is really kind of like effective for what we would call an industrial use, right? Now, around the same time, a guy by the name of Richard Arkwright invents a machine called the power loom. And what the power loom can do is it can do the work of several human weavers in less time, right? So it's a faster, cheaper way to produce textiles, right? So the first area in which industrialization really happens is textiles and fabrics, right? You can use Watt's steam engine to power Arkwright's loom and thus make a lot of fabric very cheaply with fewer workers. Yes?
I don't know if this just sounds stupid, but I thought steam engines were just like the trains.
They run on the same principle. Essentially, what a steam engine does is burn coal to produce energy, and then the energy that is produced by the burning coal moves a piston, which then moves whatever machine it's placed in, right? So that can be a loom, it can be the engine of a locomotive, right? Yeah. In fact, modern internal combustion engines in cars run on a similar principle as well. Yeah, the basic idea is you can take an energy source and use it to power a machine. That's another important factor here, is that Britain particularly in the West and the North, has very rich coal deposits. And so there was a readily available fuel for powering these steam engines. On top of this, there was a phenomenon that was increasing speed in rural areas that we've already talked about a little bit when we talked about the Wordsworths. Do you remember when we talked about enclosure? Is anybody recall this concept? What was happening in rural villages in the late 18th, early 19th centuries? Alex, you're nodding. Do you remember what this was?
Are you referring to where there was the common land and then it got divided into private lands?
Yeah, those village commons, right? Getting divided up into private lands for grazing livestock, right? So what this meant was that a lot of people couldn't support themselves in rural villages the way they used to, right? Because they would have a little subsistence garden in their part of the village green, or they would, raise their cow or their one sheep or goat or whatever on it, right? And then when they couldn't do that anymore, they could no longer survive on the land, and they moved to the city. So what enclosure ended up doing was increasing the speed of urbanization, right? So there was now a workforce readily available in these cities and kind of desperate for cash that was ready to take just about any kind of job that you throw at them. And the other thing about the kinds of factory jobs that were popping up here is that most of them were unskilled, right? You didn't need to have any particular set of skills. You didn't need to know how to weave to work a power loom, right? Anybody could do it. Children could do it, and in fact did. So these displaced rural workers end up working in these factories. The very fact of their displacement, in fact, creates the conditions for the increase in an industrial workforce, right? Okay, so the pros here, the good things that happen, the good things that come out of this. Cheaper and more plentiful manufactured goods. Right. Since it doesn't take as much time or labor to produce things as it used to, it makes manufactured goods more accessible to more people, right? They're less expensive, there are more of them to go around. In particular, when we talk about clothes, textiles, and things like that, right? That's where it starts, as we already noted. There's also a revolution in transportation. People can get around much more quickly than they used to be able to, and much more effectively than they used to, right? Not only are trains safer from things like bandit attacks than stagecoaches or riding a horse, they're also on a more reliable timetable, right? One of the things that the advent of the locomotive, of railroads, leads to is standardization of time. Right? Prior to the railroads, pretty much every village in England just kept its own time, right? People had clocks, people had watches, but they mostly lived their lives by the rhythms of the sun, right? You get up with the sun, and when the sun goes down, you go to bed. It doesn't really matter what time it is most of the time, right? But if people are traveling from village to village, and people are moving goods from village to village, time suddenly matters a lot more. And in order to make the trains run on time, you have to standardize the timetable across the nation, right? And make sure that all of the stations are keeping the same time. So it's not, so the idea of standardized time zones comes in with the railroads in the early 19th century. Pros, what are the pros? What are the pros? What else was good about this? It also increased the availability of goods from overseas. And this is related to this revolution in transportation, right? Just as a locomotive could get you around your own country more quickly and more safely, you could get across the ocean a lot faster on a steamship than you could on a wooden ship that was relying on ocean currents and wind to carry it, right? That steam engine powering the ship made it move a lot faster. So you could get people to and from North America faster. You could get people and goods to and from Europe or Africa or India faster, right? So this helped to link up various parts of the British Empire. Remember, even when we talk about North America, right, Canada was still part of the British Empire. So the cons here. Now I think that we probably already know what some of the cons were, right? What do you think were the kinds of things that went wrong in people's lives in the Industrial Revolution?
What do you mean, like how they were living?
Yeah. What was bad about it?
They were living they were living in bad conditions. I can't think of the word.
Okay, yeah. So when we get this increased urbanization, right, we get overcrowding in cities, right? The cities where this was happening were not necessarily prepared for large influxes of new residents, right? So we get overcrowding and slum conditions in a number of industrial cities. Manchester and in northern England and Glasgow in Scotland were particularly bad. Other cons.
Child labor.
Yeah. Now, one thing that we need to recognize about child labor in the Victorian period is that To the average Victorian, it's normal, right? It's something that upsets us a great deal. We get upset about it. But it persisted for decades, in large part because to the average person, the average middle class person, it was invisible, right? Think about the way Thomas Clarkson and Samuel Taylor Coleridge talked about the West Indies sugar trade, right? Where they're trying to get you to think about where your sugar comes from. And most people are just turning a blind eye to it, right? Because it's inconvenient to think about. The same thing is going on when people are asked to think about where their cheap textiles and where their cheap matches are coming from, right? The same thing happens when people are being asked where cheap fuel comes from, because a lot of children were working in coal mines. Now, the reason why children were preferred for particular jobs had to do with their small size and greater agility. Children could sometimes work a loom or a match frame more effectively than an adult could. Their hands were faster. And they could reach in to fix parts of the machine that broke that an adult couldn't. Now, this also meant that children were frequently maimed in industrial accidents. Because if you stick your hand in and the loom or the frame starts working again, your arm is going to get crushed in it, right? Coal mining as a profession, right, was, if you were an adult coal miner, you typically had to be short to do it because the ceilings of the tunnels were low. Children were the only ones who could do certain tasks within the mines because the tunnel ceilings were so low that an adult could not, even a short adult could not stoop that low. So it was normal, at least for children of the working class, to have to labor, right? And I think that this is a thing that we need to consider here, is that up until about the mid-19th century, childhood was not really considered a separate stage of development. Children were simply little adults, or adults in training, right? Aristocratic children and upper middle class children would be sent off to boarding school to learn the sorts of things they would need to know in their adult work. And working class children would do the same kind of work that their parents did, right? In the prior period, they would be working the farm with everybody else. But in the Industrial Revolution, and I think this is part of where we come gradually as a society to see child labor as wrong. They're doing the same kinds of dangerous and often degrading factory work that adults are doing. Women are also working in factories. And the reason I put child and woman labor here as cons is because they weren't paid as much as men, right? A lot of factory owners preferred them because they didn't have to pay them as much. So we can sort of stick this under low wages overall, right? And yeah, as we've already noted, many of the factories had dangerous and unsanitary conditions. Accidents were frequent. Time off was basically non-existent. Shifts were long. Right.
Even when you got hurt, you had to keep working, right? Or they just let you sit out?
Or they withhold your pay, yeah. If you're not working, you don't get paid. The restaurant industry still kind of works that way, right? Which is why, particularly with certain large chains, if you show up and your server has the sniffles, right, it's because they don't get paid if they don't show up for work. So the attitude towards labor is kind of dehumanizing here, right? It's dangerous, it's unsafe, it's unhealthy, and in many ways it's unfair. And this rise in industrialism also changes the way people start to look at poverty and the kinds of remedies that people suggest for poverty. So in the 18th century, if there were people in your community who couldn't support themselves for whatever reason, usually the community took care of them in some way, right? Within their own homes. Right, you keep them at home, the community provides for them. What happens in the 19th century is the rise of an institution called the workhouse. So, under the workhouse system, people who can't provide for themselves are moved out of their homes and into an institution. And in this institution, they are made to work essentially for their own subsistence, right? So usually they're fed and they're housed, but at very, very minimal levels, right? I don't know if any of you are familiar with like Oliver Twist, the whole, please sir, may I have some more, or the little kids are all being given little bowls of thin gruel. And he's coming up and telling the guy it's not enough. Your blank look suggests no. Okay. So, a lot of Dickens' novels center around the idea of the workhouse, right? The workhouse is often a threat looming in the background for these poor characters, even if they're not actively in one, right? And so the kinds of tasks that you had to do in the workhouse tended to be fairly pointless, right? They essentially kind of had you doing busy work. The most popular task in the workhouse was picking oakum from bits of old rope. So essentially what they would do is they would give you like a little hook, and they'd give you bits of old rope. And you were supposed to pick apart the rope and get this kind of waxy substance off of it that was then used in caulking wooden ships. Now, you couldn't possibly get enough oakum from this process to actually be of much use, no matter how many people you had doing it. But the idea here was that having people working, even if what they were doing was pointless and useless, was better than just giving them a handout and not having them not working, right?
That don't sound like that's worth nothing. Like, it doesn't sound like you're getting nothing out of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially like, one could argue that it's almost like punishing people for being poor. Alex, go ahead, what were you going to say?
How do the workhouses in turn provide for the people who live there when the things that the people are doing aren't really that important?
State funding.
Oh.
So yeah, they were funded at a minimal level by the government, like basically enough to keep people in, small beds and thin gruel, right? Like enough to keep people living at a subsistence level. So like they were still funded by the national and local governments, just like the old relief work was. It's just essentially the location of it changed, right? They moved people out of their homes and into the workhouse and insisted that they perform this labor, right? And to give you a sense of like what these workhouses look like, I know that I had one up here. There it is. So this is what the outside of a workhouse looks like. Right?
Looks nice.
There's a wall. Yeah, I mean, at least from the outside, right? But there's not much attention paid to attractiveness in architecture. Right? It's very functional, and this could essentially be any kind of institution, right? It could be a school, it could be a hospital, it could be a fucking prison, right? It could be any one of those things. And this is actually like a key component of a lot of Victorian government architecture, right? And a lot of it tends to have this kind of blocky, functional warehouse-like appearance. Now inside, what you would see would be something more like this. Right? Rows of people, see we've got, all these rows of men sitting and being supervised by town officials. And they're each sitting with a hook in one hand and a piece of rope in the other, and they're picking apart this rope manually to try to get the oakum, right? So this is what you would see if you went inside that big red brick building.
I know it was hot in there. It seemed like they all piled up on each other almost.
Yeah, overcrowding is common in factories, it's common in residences, and it's common in these workhouses as well. In fact, like a lot of private residences in poor neighborhoods, you would have several families piled on top of each other in the same building. Like basically every room, like different corners of different rooms might be rented out to different families.
The only good thing is that they sitting down while doing all that, because I know I couldn't stand up all up on each other like that. That wouldn't work.
Well, and in a lot of other occupations, you would actually be standing up. For example, here we got two kids
You got no
working
leg?
in power room. What's that?
You got no leg, or there's just a machine in front of the bed?
That's just a machine. Yeah, you see that this boy is barefoot, right?
That's what I'm saying. They don't, most places when you work in a factory, they'll be like, wear some shoes. I mean, I know it's hard times though.
Well, yeah, and it's also an age in which there's no OSHA, right, coming around, with safety rules, right?
Yeah.
There basically are no rules or regulations in any of these factories. And often people who advocated for safety rules in these factories were kind of laughed at as cranks. Because that was the kind of thing that could cut into profits, right?
Yeah.
One thing that we need to remember is the animating philosophy, two of the animating philosophies of this period. The first, I think we've already talked about. Does anybody remember what utilitarianism was about? Does this ring a bell for anybody?
I'm trying to find it. Oh, I got it. Well, was it? I'm probably thinking of something. Was it? No. Hold on. I don't want to say the wrong thing. Was it an idea to be judged by its usefulness?
Yes, that's the basic tenet of utilitarianism, right? That an idea should be judged by its usefulness. And the definition of useful here is very specific, right? An idea that is useful is one that reduces pain and increases pleasure for the greatest number of people. And if the products of these factories give pleasure to more people than the production of them harms, then for a utilitarian, at least for a strict utilitarian, that's largely okay. Now the other big idea in Victorian society that animates a lot of this policy is called Malthusianism. It's named for a guy by the name of Thomas Malthus. And Malthus was a clergyman and an early economist who argued that because population increases exponentially with each generation, eventually you are going to run out of land and resources for everyone. Right? That as population continues to increase, you are eventually going to simply run out of ways to feed everybody. And so, while Malthus himself did not argue for this, in respectable middle-class society, some kind of winnowing out process was seen as largely more or less okay, right? As long as people didn't have to look at it. Now, one of the other issues here to focus on is power, right? Who has power in this system and who doesn't? So, if we look at the way government and elections were structured, members of parliament were not paid. Now, for those of us who are used to feeling kind of cynical about politics, right, our first impulse might be to think, well, why the hell should they be, right? Screw those guys. But why does it matter if members of parliament, if elected officials aren't paid? What does that mean about who can run for office and who can serve?
Only the people who are already able to provide for themselves.
Yes. It means that only people who are already independently wealthy or have a wealthy patron can actually stand for parliament, right? Can actually take a seat in parliament. Because most people can't afford to not work for several months, to not get paid for several months out of the year, right?
Because I was going to say, I know like you're saying around this time, did they ever get paid? Wasn't that stuff always like, not voluntary, but kind of, I guess, like voluntary, I guess?
Yeah, to an extent, and I think, particularly in a government that kind of grows out of an aristocracy, most people's wealth was in land rather than in salary, right? If you're a baron, for example, you're rich because you own a shit ton of land, not because you actually have a lot of cash on hand, right? Or because someone actually gives you money to do something. So the old system was based, in the old system, wealth was based on land ownership. And I think there's still some kind of carryover from that, right? Here we're transitioning, we're still in the middle of a transition to a system where wealth is based on cash and not simply on land ownership, if that makes sense. Now, another issue here is what was called the issue of rotten boroughs. How many of you know what gerrymandering is?
What's it called?
Gerrymandering. How many of you have heard this term before? Okay, Alex, what's gerrymandering?
Oh, I don't know. I've heard of it, but I'm not sure what it is.
Is it something illegal? No?
Well, not really. Essentially, what gerrymandering is the American term for this. Gerrymandering is drawing electoral districts in such a way as to advantage one party or one candidate over another, right? So, the party that controls the state legislature in most states gets to draw the electoral districts, right? And oftentimes, if there is no law against doing so, they will draw the districts so as to give themselves a kind of permanent built-in advantage. The rotten boroughs were kind of like this, right? What the rotten boroughs were these depopulated electoral districts where there were maybe only one or two large landowners who actually were able to vote. And they could just sort of put forward whoever they wanted and get their candidate chosen so that they would have influence in Parliament, right? The problem with the rotten boroughs is that you had very, very few people with an outsized amount of power because they could just get their guy into Parliament, right? Now the other issue here is that there were property qualifications for MPs and voters. Not only did you have to have a certain amount of property in order to run for Parliament, you also had to own property of a certain value in order to vote. So the vast majority of people in Britain had no say in who got to sit in Parliament. So in 1838, a group that comes to be known as the Chartists, made up of labor leaders mostly, comes up with a document they call the People's Charter, which is basically a kind of blueprint for government reform that would make things more fair for everybody, right? And the People's Charter includes 6 demands, most of which address directly these problems that we've already noted with the way government is put together, but where power is located. So one of the demands is votes for all men over age 21. All right, so women are still not included here in the franchise, but at least the idea is to, at the very least, give men of all classes a vote if they're over 21, right? So any man who has reached majority age. They also demand equal population in parliamentary constituencies to deal with this rotten boroughs problem, right? That no, we shouldn't have these districts, these constituencies, where only 2 or 3 people can actually vote, right? There should be a more or less equal number of voters in every constituency. They want to eliminate property qualifications for MPs. Secret ballots. Right? There was at the time no secret ballot. Everybody knew who you voted for because you went and declared yourself publicly for a particular candidate. MPs would be paid a salary. And finally, elections for Parliament would be held annually. Parliamentary elections were and still are held kind of irregularly. I think that the current law states that you have to have one at least every 7 years. But the Prime Minister can basically call an election whenever he wants to, right? Usually, when elections occur in Britain today, it's either because the Prime Minister has lost the confidence of his party and can't keep his members in line, or because the Prime Minister thinks it's a particularly advantageous time for his party to gain more seats, right? So that was what happened in the last parliamentary election. The ruling party, the Conservatives, decided it was a good time for them to pick up more seats in Parliament to get support for the whole Brexit strategy that they were trying to propose. And so they held an election when they didn't need to, right? Constitutionally. So some of these recommendations eventually, over time, are adopted into law. Some of them not. Some of them have not been, right? There's still not equal population in constituencies, although rotten boroughs are gone. And we do not have annual elections for Parliament, right? Those are things that still do not happen. But yeah, so this is kind of what the picture of government power and labor relations looks like for much of the 19th century. Right? Any change or reform is a very, very slow process. I believe, in fact, that child labor remains legal in Britain until the 1890s. Right? It takes that long for even that level of reform to occur. And, you know, a lot of this, I think, simply has to do with the amount of wealth that the Industrial Revolution brings into the country and the amount of power that it gives to these captains of industry, right? We can relate this back to a lot of the stuff that we've been reading. What was Thomas Carlyle's big argument? What did Carlyle believe? Where did Carlyle believe meaning was to be found in your life?
You said like out of both of his stories, or you're just saying what he believed in himself?
Well, yeah, I'm just like, in Sartor Resartus, right? What is he arguing for? If you feel unsatisfied with your life, what does he think you should be doing? If you feel like there's a void inside you that needs to be filled, what do you fill it with? Pardon? Remember, guys, all these things we're looking at are interrelated, right? So it's always a good idea when you are reading something new to try to link it back to something we've already read, right?
Was it
No, I mean, this is a specific thing, right?
Like a definition.
Yeah, well, like Carlyle's whole idea, right, is that work is what gives life meaning. And if the old pillars of society, the kings and the priests, are falling away, then who better to take their place than the benevolent industrialist, right? The problem being that the whole scheme assumes the benevolence of the industrialist, which is often, at the very least, questionable. Like if we look at that, the text that you were asking about, Kyle, at the beginning of class, on page 651, about the match workers, right? A very bitter memory survives in the factory. Mr. Theodore Bryant, the owner of the match factory, to show his admiration of Mr. Gladstone and the greatness of his own public spirit, bethought him to erect a statue to that eminent statesman. So William Gladstone, the guy to whom he's erecting the statue, is actually an important figure to know about. Gladstone was the leader of the Liberal Party in Parliament in the late 19th century. It is also important to note that liberal in this context doesn't mean the same thing that we typically use it to mean, right? We usually use the word liberal in the United States as a synonym for left, for the political left, right? We're actually using it wrong. It's not what it really means. But the Liberal Party in the 19th century were really more of what we would call a free market libertarian party, right? They were in favor of largely unregulated markets and kind of keeping a hands-off approach to business. And also in favor of individual freedoms, right? So very close to what we would today call libertarianism in the United States. So that's the actual ideology that Gladstone is associated with, was a promoter of. So Theodore Bryant, the owner of the match factory, builds a statue to William Gladstone. And how does he do this, right? In order that his work girls might have the privilege of contributing, he stopped 1 shilling each out of their wages and further deprived them of half a day's work by closing the factory, giving them a holiday. So how does he pay for his statue of this politician he admires?
He takes away from their paychecks, I guess, or their money.
Yeah, he docks their wages, right?
But, like, I was wondering if I'm correct, when I was reading it, you know, they're barely making a lot of money as it is. So when I kept seeing that, oh, they take money from this, they take money from that, and I'm like, well, they won't have none as much as y'all keep taking away.
You're seeing the point.
Because they barely make money now. What are you taking away from?
Exactly. So I think you did understand what's happening in the piece, right? Yeah, that these, not only were the conditions in some of these factories dangerous, but the pay schemes, particularly for women, were exploitative, right? They're barely getting paid as it is, but he is taking a shilling out of their pay for how long here? Okay, it doesn't say for how long. So he takes a shilling out of their wages, and he stops work for half a day, right? Now, remember what we said about what's happening if you're not working, if you're a factory worker in this era. What does that mean is also not happening? Yeah, you're not getting paid, right? This is why, the worker that's quoted here says, right, "We don't want no holidays," said one of the girls pathetically, "for needless to say, the poorer employees of such a firm lose their wages when a holiday is given."
But you would think they want a break, but like you said, they would lose money and they barely
Yeah.
get money now.
Mm-hmm. And he's already taking a shilling out of their pay to pay for his statue, right?
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
How much is a shilling actually worth?
Yeah.
A shilling, it is hard to say in today's money. The old British currency system is weird, right?
It just seemed like it was enough to feed them breakfast and lunch, or the breakfast and dinner.
Yeah, so they're basically being paid a subsistence wage. I'll sort of give you like kind of like the relative like grades of value here. So you have a pound is the most valuable piece of currency, right?
Yeah.
That's still the case. Below the pound, you have shillings, pennies, and farthings. Right, so a certain number of shillings make up a pound, a certain number of pennies make up a shilling, and a certain number of farthings make up a penny. I can't remember exactly what all the conversions are, but it's actually in the back of the book. There's an appendix that tells you how the money system worked. They're on, since the 70s, they've been on a decimal system like everybody else, where only pounds still exist, but the rest of these denominations don't anymore. But a shilling, for laborers at this level, would be a not insignificant amount of money. So if he's stopping a shilling out of their wages, they're taking a pretty big financial hit to build this statue for him, right?
And they couldn't really save up like that. Even if they wanted to get nicer things, they couldn't really save up like that because money was always getting taken, right?
Yeah. To give you a good analogy for this, I grew up in northeast Pennsylvania, which was a big coal mining area. And when I was a kid, like every other school field trip we took was down at another goddamn coal mine. But one of the things we learned about was the way the coal companies operated and the way they paid miners, and the way the miners in who worked for most of the companies had to shop at the company store. Right? Essentially, their groceries and their equipment costs, right? They paid for their own equipment. The company didn't pay for their equipment. Were taken directly out of their wages. So they would go to the company store at the end of the week, pick up their supplies, which were sold at inflated cost, and then be given whatever a couple of pennies were left over. And that's similar to what's happening to these girls in the match factory, right? Now, there were other risks associated with working in match factories and also in what were called white lead factories. They made pigments to be used in paint that were out of lead. So how many of you have ever heard stories about 19th century artists going a little nuts from lead paint on their brushes because they used to clean the brushes in their mouths?
Wasn't it that guy who made that painting and he got real, I can't think of the painting or the artist's name, but wasn't it that one guy who got famous for that one painting that he made? Something like that. Because he was going crazy off that little stuff, I can't think of it.
Well, it was a fairly common phenomenon, actually. A lot of painters went a little nuts from lead poisoning. Again, like I said, because they typically clean the brushes in them, particularly if they're out in the field, like painting outdoors. They typically clean their brushes in their mouths. The women who worked in the factories who made those paints also often got lead poisoning, which led to paralysis. And the girls who worked in match factories tended to get a condition called phossy jaw. Basically because they were working with a chemical element called phosphorus without any kind of protection. It would lead to a paralysis of the jaw. So, yeah, go ahead.
Did they not know that these things were dangerous, like lead and phosphorus, or did they just not know?
A little of both. I think they didn't really recognize how dangerous some of these things were, especially because many of these were substances that people had been working with for centuries, but not on this scale. right? What was new here was the mass production scale. Not so much that people were working with phosphorus, to make matches, or that people were using lead to make paints, things like that, right? The Greeks used white lead to make paints, right? So these were ancient processes, but being sped up by industrialization and being used, the fact that the work was being performed by unskilled workers as well led to more accidents and more problems. So I would like to take just a second here to look at one literary example here of an industrial town, right? There were towns that were specifically set up around a mill, right? So a factory owner would come, put up a mill someplace where there wasn't already a town, or where the town was small, and the town would be kind of built up and planned around it, right? So if we look on page 645, Charles Dickens' description of Coketown describes one of these planned mill communities. And these weren't always terrible. There was one in Scotland, about 25 miles from Glasgow. It's called New Lanark. And the owner of the mill was a socialist by the name of Robert Owen, who made sure that provision was made for all of the workers' needs, and the workers were happy, contented, and well paid, and the mill was still profitable. So he showed that you could actually run a mill in a mill town on humane principles and still make money. But most did not operate on those kinds of principles. And we see a divide in the period between the north of England, which rapidly industrialized. Right? Remember, that was where most of the coal was, right? The north and west. And the south, much of which remained rural and underdeveloped, with the exception of the area around London, which is still where most of the power was seated within England. So let's look briefly at what Coketown looks like here in Dickens's description. It was a town of red brick, or of brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it. But as matters stood, it was a town of unnatural red and black, like the painted face of a savage. It was a town of machinery and tall chimneys, out of which interminable serpents of smoke trailed themselves forever and ever, and never got uncoiled. It had a black canal in it, and a river that ran purple with ill-smelling dye, and vast piles of buildings full of windows where there was a rattling and a trembling all day long, and where the piston of the steam engine worked monotonously up and down like the head of an elephant in a state of melancholy madness. It contained several large streets, all very like one another, and many small streets still more like one another, inhabited by people equally like one another, who all went in and out at the same hours, with the same sound upon the same pavements, to do the same work, and to whom every day was the same as yesterday and tomorrow, and every year the counterpart of the last and the next. So what kind of impression do we get of an industrial town from this? What does this town look like, smell like, feel like?
Like it's all centered around the industrial part, and there's no uniqueness.
Okay, yeah, everything looks the same, right? There's a sameness to all of the buildings and all of the routines. You remember what I said about industrial and state architecture and how it all kind of looked like that big red brick workhouse? Everything here also kind of looks like that, right? These are described as big red brick warehouses everywhere, right? What else do we get about this town from this paragraph? What else do we learn about this town?
Seems unsanitary.
Okay, yeah, unsanitary conditions, right? We have smoke pouring up out of the sky, into the sky from the smokestacks. The river is badly polluted, right? And in fact, I think it also is important to note how he describes the river being polluted. It had a black canal in it and a river that ran purple with ill-smelling dye. Does that kind of look like, is that reminiscent of, maybe a well-known biblical image? 10 plagues of Egypt, river running with blood. Yeah, I think this is meant to be reminiscent of that, right? But the air's polluted, the water's polluted.
It seems closed in.
Okay, and yeah, closed in. And what does this town sound like?
Noisy.
Yeah, it's loud all the time, right? There's this repetitive, monotonous rattling that is constant, right? Right, the factories never stop going. They never stop making noise. They never stop kicking smoke up into the air. They never stop spitting dye out into the river, right? So it's this kind of this constant cycle of disturbance. What's the pardon?
Pollution.
Yeah. Yeah, the pollution is sort of like one kind of disturbance, right? But we're sort of like given a world here where human life exists where it shouldn't really be possible, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say, it sounds like if you was to stay over there, you're probably sick by now, or it sounds unhealthy to live over there.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably hard to get even get something as simple as a decent night's sleep, right? These attributes of Coketown were in the main inseparable from the work by which it was sustained. Against them were to be set off comforts of life which found their way all over the world, and elegancies of life which made, we will not ask how much, of the fine lady, who could scarcely bear to hear the place mentioned. The rest of its features were voluntary and they were these, right? So this is, again, that invisibility we were talking about, right? All of the things that people with quality are buying that are coming from these new factories are produced by this invisible labor that people don't want to talk about or think about or look at, right? Because it's ugly. Right? The fact of its existence is ugly and brutal. And people don't want to face up to it. So that seems to be a relative constant here, right? By the time Dickens is writing this piece, 1854, slavery is illegal in the West Indies, and the slaves have been emancipated. Although Britain has already by this point imported a new cheap labor force into the West Indies, mostly of people from the lower socioeconomic brackets of India, who are being exploited in much the same way that the slaves were before emancipation. But we see a similar system here within England itself, right? And a similar unwillingness to face up to what it looks like. And when we read A Christmas Carol for next time, right? I'm sure everybody's more or less familiar with this, the Ebenezer Scrooge and all that, right? And the Three Ghosts, and it's this kind of sentimental Christmas favorite. What I want you guys to focus on as you are reading it is the way Dickens is trying to make the reader, through the character of Scrooge, face up to the facts of Victorian economics. So that's what we're going to talk about next time. Does anybody have any questions about what we did today?
I was just say, even if you do know how to, like you said, even if you do Australian stories, you still have to.
Yes, you still have to read it. You still have to do the reading part because the movies do not always accurately convey what is actually in the story, right? There's a lot that is of necessity left out
You're right.
and sometimes rewritten. And also, yeah, like, the movies are often more aimed at giving you a kind of warm, fuzzy feeling and less aimed at facing these same issues directly in the way that Dickens was. All right, so, so that's what we're doing for next time. And we'll see you on Thursday.
Do you want us to wipe off the?
Yes, I do.